The most damaging clinical assessment of my life was written about me by a therapist who had never heard my voice. She diagnosed my character, labeled my motives, and reinforced every fear my estranged son had about me, all without a single conversation. And she did it from behind a license I also hold. My name is David. I'm a retired family therapist with 30 years of experience, and I used my own profession's rulebook to stop her. For 3 decades, my job was to help families repair their fractures. Then I found myself on the other side of the couch, watching a stranger use the very tools of my trade to widen the canyon between me and my only child. This is the story of a quiet war fought not with shouts, but with paperwork. A battle where the weapon was a clinical diagnosis and the battlefield was my son's mind. And it all began with a single sentence in a treatment report I was never meant to see. The sentence was in the 3rd paragraph of a treatment plan update, a document I only saw because my son, Ben, had left his patient portal open on my computer. It read, "Client continues to process the manipulative and emotionally neglectful patterns of the paternal relationship." My name was not used, but the reference was unambiguous. I read it 3 times. The clinical coldness of the language was a shock, but the greater shock was the signature at the bottom. The treating clinician was Dr. Anya Vance, LCSW. I knew her by reputation. She ran a successful group practice specializing in what she called family systems repair. I had even referred a few clients to her years prior, back when I was still practicing. The irony was so thick I could taste it. My son Ben is 28. For the first 22 years of his life, we were close. He was an artist, sensitive and bright, who saw the world in shades I sometimes missed. His mother, Elena, was the vibrant center of our family. She was a painter. She died in a car accident when Ben was 17. The grief did not break us apart at first. We clung to each other. I took a sabbatical from my practice. We spent that first year in a kind of numb, mutual custody, checking in like 2 survivors on a life raft. But grief is a solvent. Over time, it began to eat away at the bonds it initially tightened. Ben went to college out of state. The distance became emotional as well as geographic. Our weekly calls grew shorter, more strained. He was angry, but the target was amorphous. The universe, fate, sometimes me. I was the closest representative of the life that had been taken from him. I understood that clinically. Personally, it was a slow bleed. He started drinking heavily his junior year. There was a DUI, then a rehab stint that didn't stick. After graduation, he moved back to the city but not home. He lived with friends, worked sporadic jobs, and the cycle continued. Every attempt I made to help was met with defiance or silence. He told me I was therapizing him, that I was using my professional tools to avoid being his father. 2 years ago, after another crisis, he announced he was seeing someone new. A real therapist, he said, the edge in his voice sharp enough to cut. Someone who gets it. That someone was Dr. Vance. I was cautiously hopeful. If he was engaging with treatment, that was progress. For the first few months, he seemed better, more stable. He was holding down a job. We even had a few civil lunches. I asked him once gently how therapy was going. He shut down immediately. "It's my space, Dad, not yours." I respected that boundary. It's the first rule we learn. The therapeutic alliance is sacred. But then a new vocabulary entered his speech. Words like narcissistic supply, parentification, covert contracts. They were clinical terms, but they were deployed as weapons, always aimed at me. Our interactions became forensic exercises. A simple question about his work was an interrogation. An expression of concern was emotional manipulation. The man I raised was receding, replaced by a case study I seemed to have starred in. I began to suspect Dr. Vance was not just listening to his narrative, but actively cementing it. A good therapist helps a client examine their story, not become its prisoner. The breaking point was a phone call last October. Ben was upset about a work conflict. I listened, then offered what I thought was a neutral suggestion about speaking with his supervisor. His response was instantaneous and venomous. "You always do this. You pathologize every problem I have so you can feel like the expert. You can't just be my dad. You have to be Dr. Miller, the fixer. It's pathetic." He hung up. The accusation was so precise, so perfectly framed in therapeutic jargon, it felt rehearsed. It felt taught. That's when I did something I'm not proud of. The next time he visited, I asked to use his laptop to look up a restaurant. He went to the bathroom. The browser was open. I saw the patient portal tab and I looked. I know the breach of trust was profound, but the fear was more profound. The document I found wasn't just notes. It was a 12-page biopsychosocial assessment and treatment plan, and my role in Ben's life was not that of a grieving, flawed father. I was a clinical feature. The report stated Ben was recovering from a lifetime of psychological control and emotional enmeshment with a father figure who used professional credentials to maintain dominance. It cited patterns consistent with relational trauma. The recommended treatment goals included building defenses against paternal guilt tripping and internalizing the understanding that the client's failures are not authentic, but a product of engineered dependency. Nowhere in the document did it state, "The father has not been evaluated." Nowhere did it say, "These conclusions are based solely on the client's self-report." It was presented as settled clinical fact. I felt a cold, professional fury. This wasn't therapy. This was ideological grooming. Dr. Vance had taken my son's raw, legitimate pain and had given it a blueprint, with me cast as the architect of all his suffering. She had provided the enemy, and in doing so, had made herself the only possible savior. The ethical violations were glaring. She was practicing outside her competence by diagnosing someone she'd never met. She was failing to note the limitations of her assessment. She was potentially causing harm by reinforcing a divisive narrative. I knew the rulebook. I had taught it. I closed the browser. When Ben came back, I said nothing. The father in me was heartbroken. The therapist in me was already building a case. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a professional malpractice, and I had the credentials, the experience, and now the evidence to file a formal complaint with the state licensing board. But to do that, I would need to weaponize my profession against a colleague. I would have to turn my son's most trusted confidant into a defendant. And in doing so, I would likely destroy any last shred of a relationship with my son. I printed the document. The sound of the printer whirring in the next room felt like a point of no return. I held the pages in my hands, the weight of them all wrong. This was the diagnosis that was poisoning my family, and I was about to use it as Exhibit A. I spent the next week assembling my complaint not as a heartbroken father, but as a clinical supervisor reviewing a dangerously flawed case file. I worked at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd once helped Ben with his homework. Now I was annotating the printed treatment plan with yellow highlighters and red pen, circling each ethical breach, failure to acknowledge assessment limitations, practicing outside scope of competence by diagnosing an unmet third party, potential for harm by reinforcing a fixed, adversarial narrative. The language was dry, procedural. It insulated me from the raw hurt. I drafted a cover letter to the State Behavioral Sciences Licensing Board. I identified myself as David Miller, PhD, licensed marriage and family therapist, license number 84211, retired. I stated I was filing a complaint regarding the conduct of Dr. Anya Vance, LCSW, license number 51077. I attached the annotated treatment plan. I wrote, the attached clinical document presents a diagnosis and treatment framework for an individual, the client's father, whom the clinician has never met, interviewed, or evaluated. This constitutes a clear violation of Standard 2.05 regarding bases for assessments and raises serious concerns about Standard 3.04, avoiding harm. I did not mention Ben was my son. The complaint was deliberately sterile, a professional-to-professional correction. I mailed the packet certified. The click of the mailbox door was the loudest sound I'd heard in days. Then, the silence of waiting. It took 3 weeks for the board to acknowledge receipt. A form letter, your complaint has been received and will be reviewed to determine if it falls within the board's jurisdiction and merits investigation. The bureaucratic language was a cold comfort. The real storm hit 48 hours later. My phone rang. It was Ben. His voice was a controlled tremor of fury. Did you file a complaint against my therapist? No hello, just the accusation launched like a spear. I took a breath. I filed a complaint regarding a clinician's ethical conduct, yes. You went behind my back. You attacked the one person who's been helping me. Do you have any idea how violated she feels? How violated I feel? He was shouting now. She called me, crying. She said a complaint could jeopardize her entire practice, her livelihood. Is that what you want? Ben, the document I saw. You had no right to see it. It's confidential. You committed a crime. I know, I said, my voice low, and I will live with that. But her putting those words in a permanent record about me without ever speaking to me, that is also a violation. A professional one. She turned me into a cartoon villain in your head. That's not therapy, that's malpractice. There was a long silence on the line, filled only by his ragged breathing. When he spoke again, the fury had hardened into something worse, finality. She told me you'd do this. She said you'd try to discredit her because she's helping me see the truth. She called it counterattack behavior. And here you are, proving her right. You're not my father anymore. You're just a complaint. The line went dead. The words, "you're not my father anymore," didn't feel like a knife. They felt like the absence of air. I sat there for an hour, maybe two, in the silent living room. I had predicted this, but the reality was a physical weight. I had chosen my professional ethics over my last connection to my son, and in that moment, I couldn't tell if it was an act of principle or of monumental pride. The board's next letter came 2 weeks later. The complaint had been accepted for formal investigation. They assigned an investigator. They would be contacting Dr. Vance for her response. The process was now a machine in motion, and I was just a cog that had set it spinning. I felt a profound loneliness. I had no one to talk to about it. My colleagues were retired or would see it as a messy, personal conflict. Elena was gone. Ben was gone. Then an email arrived. It was from a woman named Sarah. The subject line read, "Ray, your complaint against Anya Vance." My heart hammered. How did a stranger know? I opened it cautiously. "Dr. Miller," it began. "I found your name listed as the complainant in the board's public docket. I've been trying to get someone to listen about her for 2 years. My daughter was her client. What happened to your family happened to mine. If you're willing to talk, please call me." The public docket, of course. Once an investigation is opened, it becomes a matter of public record. My anonymity was gone. I stared at the email. This wasn't just about me and Ben anymore. Sarah's words, "What happened to your family happened to mine," suggested a pattern. I called her that evening. Her story was a haunting echo. Her daughter, Chloe, had entered therapy with Dr. Vance at 19 after a difficult breakup. Sarah, a single mother, had been initially grateful, but then her daughter's attitude toward her shifted. She was accused of being enmeshed, of infantilizing her. Dr. Vance's treatment notes, which Sarah eventually saw during a hospitalization crisis, described Sarah as having cluster B traits and being the primary source of her daughter's relational trauma. Sarah, a school librarian, had never met Dr. Vance. "She diagnosed me with a personality disorder from second-hand stories," Sarah said, her voice trembling with anger. "My daughter dropped out of college. She's now living in a halfway house, convinced I'm toxic. I filed a complaint too, but it was dismissed for lack of evidence. They said it was a he said, she said, clinical disagreement." Sarah connected me with 2 other parents. A father whose son was convinced his father's covert narcissism was why he couldn't hold a job. A mother whose daughter had been guided to cut off all contact after Dr. Vance labeled the family systemically abusive. In each case, the same pattern. The therapist formed an intensely allied bond with the young adult client, validated their deepest resentments, pathologized the parents without evaluation, and provided a clinical framework for permanent estrangement. We were not perfect parents. We were flawed, we made mistakes, but we were not the cartoon monsters these documents portrayed. We were being systematically erased from our children's lives under the guise of treatment. This was the pivot. This was no longer about my singular conflict. Dr. Vance wasn't just a therapist making a bad call with Ben. She appeared to be running a playbook. Her specialization in family systems repair seemed to involve surgically removing the family from the system and installing herself as the new primary attachment. The stakes had just exploded. This was about multiple families, multiple young adults being guided down a path of irreversible rupture. Armed with this, I submitted a supplemental package to the licensing board investigator, outlining the pattern and including anonymized statements from Sarah and the others. I felt a grim sense of purpose. This was bigger than my heartbreak. I was no longer just a father fighting for his son. I was a whistleblower. The investigator, a man named Mark with a tired, patient voice, called me. "Dr. Miller, we've received your additional information. We will be looking into it. However, I need to inform you that Dr. Vance has submitted her formal response, and she has filed a counter-complaint against you." The room tilted. Against me for what? For alleged breaches of client confidentiality, given your familial relationship to the client, and for, let me see, using professional credentials to harass and intimidate a colleague in an attempt to sabotage therapeutic progress and maintain pathological control over an adult child. She claims your complaint is a direct manifestation of the very issues she is treating your son for. It was a masterstroke. She was using my complaint as proof of her diagnosis. She was weaponizing the board's process to clinically validate her framework. Ben would see this as the ultimate confirmation. "See, Dad is so manipulative, he's even trying to get my therapist fired." The machine I had started was now turning on me, gears grinding in a perfect, tragic circle. I was no longer just a complainant. I was a respondent. The battle lines were now drawn in official ink, and my son was firmly in the enemy camp, holding the flag she had given him. The counter-complaint was a legal and psychological trap designed to reframe my defense as proof of my guilt. To fight it, I had to stop being a father and even a therapist. I had to become a detective. I hired a lawyer, Martin Lowe, who specialized in professional licensing defense. "You're in the unusual position of being both the accuser and the accused," he said, scanning the board's letters in his downtown office. "Vance's move is aggressive. She's trying to muddy the waters and put you on the defensive. The board hates," he said, she said, "family dramas. They might dismiss both complaints just to avoid the mess." "This isn't a family drama," I said, sliding the folder of statements from Sarah and the other parents across his desk. "It's a pattern of practice." Martin spent a silent 10 minutes reading. When he looked up, his demeanor had changed. The casual professionalism was gone, replaced by focused intensity. "This changes everything," he said. "A single questionable diagnosis is a judgment call. A repeated pattern across multiple cases is a protocol. It suggests intent. The board can't ignore this." Our strategy pivoted. We weren't just responding to her counter-complaint. We were building a negligence case against her entire methodology. Martin advised me to cease all direct contact with the board investigator. Everything would go through him. This was now a legal proceeding. The personal was being systematically leached out, replaced by affidavits, evidence codes, and procedural deadlines. I felt like I was watching my own life being translated into a foreign, cold language. Then the first major discovery. Sarah, the librarian, had been digging through online therapist review sites and court databases. She found something I had missed. 2 years ago, a family had filed a civil lawsuit against Dr. Anya Vance and her practice. The details were sealed after a settlement, but the public docket header was telling: wrongful death, negligent infliction of emotional distress. My blood ran cold. Sarah managed to contact the family's former attorney, who, bound by confidentiality, could only say this: the case involved a young adult client who had become estranged from their family under Dr. Vance's care. That client had later died by suicide. The lawsuit alleged the therapeutic relationship had catastrophically isolated the client from their natural support system. This wasn't just about estrangement anymore. This was about life and death. The potential for harm, cited in my dry complaint, now had a face, a name, and a tombstone. The gravity of the situation pressed down on me with a new, awful weight. This woman's methods weren't just ethically questionable, they were potentially dangerous, and my son was in her care. Martin submitted the docket information to the board as part of our growing evidence file. The investigation, he said, would now almost certainly escalate from a routine review to a full disciplinary hearing. A hearing where I, and potentially the other parents, would have to testify under oath. A hearing where Ben could be called as a witness for Dr. Vance. The board sent a formal notice. A pre-hearing conference was scheduled for 2 months' time. Both parties were ordered to appear with counsel. This was really happening. The machine was grinding toward a public, professional reckoning. Around this time, I received a letter from Dr. Vance's attorney. It was not sent to the board. It was sent to me personally. It was a settlement offer. The letter was a masterpiece of legalistic gaslighting. It stated that Dr. Vance, while maintaining she committed no ethical violations, was willing to resolve both complaints to avoid further distress to all parties, particularly the vulnerable client at the center of this dispute. The terms were this: I would withdraw my complaint and issue a statement acknowledging my misunderstanding of clinical boundaries. In return, she would withdraw her counter-complaint. The matter would be closed. No hearing. No record. The letter concluded, "This offer is made in the best interest of your son's continued therapeutic progress, which is currently being severely disrupted by this conflict." It was a bribe wrapped in a threat. She was offering me a way to make it all go away, to protect my son. Progress that meant his permanent alienation from me. All I had to do was sign a paper saying I was wrong, that I was the overstepping, manipulative father she had diagnosed. It would give her total victory and clinical vindication. Ben would see it as my surrender, my admission of guilt. It was the most sophisticated piece of manipulation I had ever encountered. She was using my love for my son as leverage to secure her own professional immunity. I showed the letter to Martin. "She's scared," he said flatly. "The pattern evidence, the old lawsuit, she doesn't want this in front of a disciplinary panel. This is her trying to shut it down. If you say no, she's going to come at you harder." I thought about it for a long, terrible night. The easy path was there: sign the paper, end the war, and live with the hollow peace of knowing I'd sacrificed the truth to stop the bleeding. But then I thought of Sarah's daughter in the halfway house. I thought of the unnamed client from the sealed lawsuit. I thought of the other parents, their voices trembling on the phone. If I signed, I wasn't just selling out my own integrity. I was abandoning them. I was leaving the door open for her to do this to another family and another. I wrote my response on a single line of paper and faxed it to her attorney. It read, "I decline your offer. See you at the hearing." The backlash was swift. A week later, I was served with a civil lawsuit. Dr. Vance was suing me for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and interference with business relationships. She claimed my false and malicious complaints had caused significant damage to her reputation and practice. She was seeking $250,000 in damages. The lawsuit was another tactical escalation, a brutal attempt to bankrupt me into silence. The personal, the professional, and now the financial, every pillar of my life was under attack. But the lawsuit also gave us something we didn't have before: the power of discovery. In a civil case, we could legally demand documents, emails, client records, things the licensing board couldn't easily access. Martin's eyes lit up. "She's overplayed her hand," he said. "Now we can subpoena her." What we found in those documents was the final, shocking piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just in her treatment notes. It was in her business model. Client invoices showed she charged a premium for family systems intensive packages. Internal practice emails discussed high-conflict family units as primary client retention opportunities. And most damningly, we found draft templates for the very treatment plans used for Ben, Sarah's daughter, and the others. They were generic documents with blank spaces for the clients' and parents' names, pre-filled with the same clinical jargon: enmeshment, covert control, relational trauma. She wasn't crafting individual care plans. She was using a template. My son's deepest pain, his fractured relationship with me, had been slotted into a pre-written narrative. His therapy was, in part, a cut-and-paste job. The final discovery was a series of emails between Dr. Vance and a continuing education company. She was developing a workshop to teach her family estrangement protocol to other therapists. She was planning to franchise her method. What we had uncovered was not merely a negligent therapist. It was the blueprint for a small, profitable industry built on facilitating family rupture. I sat in Martin's office, looking at the subpoenaed evidence. The anger had burned away, leaving behind a clear, cold certainty. This was so much bigger than me. The hearing wasn't just about saving my relationship with Ben. That ship may have already sailed. It was about exposing a systemic poison within the very profession I had dedicated my life to. The gavel would fall in 30 days. I would take the stand, not as a perfect father, but as a witness to a profound betrayal of trust. And I would have to look across the room at my son, who believed with all his heart that I was the villain in this story. The final battle would be fought in a sterile hearing room, and the casualty would be, one way or another, what was left of my family. The hearing room was nothing like a courtroom. It was a bland, windowless conference space in a state office building, but the air was thick with the gravity of a trial. The disciplinary panel sat at a long table, two licensed clinical social workers, a psychologist, and a public member. They looked tired, overworked, but attentive. My lawyer, Martin, sat to my right. Across the room, Dr. Anya Vance sat with her attorney. She was in her 40s, dressed in a professional, soft blue sweater. She looked like someone you would instinctively trust. She did not look at me. Ben was there. He sat in the public seating area behind her. He wore a jacket I didn't recognize. His face was pale, set in a mask of grim loyalty. When I walked in, his eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, then flicked away as if from something toxic that hurt more than any legal argument. The board's attorney presented the case. She outlined my complaint, the diagnosis of an unmet individual, the failure to note limitations, the potential for harm. Then she presented the pattern. She introduced anonymized summaries from Sarah and the other parents. She entered into evidence the subpoenaed documents, the template treatment plans, the internal emails discussing client retention, the invoices for the intensive packages. Watching Dr. Vance's face as these were discussed was like watching ice form. Her calm, therapeutic demeanor never cracked, but a rigidity settled in her shoulders. Then it was my turn to testify. I was sworn in. Martin guided me through my professional history, establishing my expertise. Then he asked the central question. Dr. Miller, based on your training and experience, what is the ethical breach when a clinician diagnoses someone they have never met? I looked at the panel, then involuntarily at Ben. It is a fundamental failure, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. It replaces assessment with assumption. It turns therapy from an exploration of the client's experience into a confirmation of their biases. In this case, it took my son's grief and anger, which were real and valid, and gave them a single, immutable source, me. It removed all ambiguity, all complexity. In doing so, it closed a door that therapy is meant to hold open. It made estrangement the goal, not understanding. Martin had me identify the template documents, showing how the language in Ben's plan matched them verbatim. He asked if this was consistent with good care. It is assembly line therapy, I said. It applies a one-size-fits-all narrative of family pathology. It is the opposite of individualized care. During my testimony, I saw Ben shift in his seat. He was staring at the table, his jaw tight. He was listening. Dr. Vance's attorney cross-examined me aggressively. He focused on my breach of confidentiality, my theft of the document. He painted me as a controlling father who couldn't let go, who was using the board to punish a therapist for succeeding where I had failed. Isn't it true, Dr. Miller, that you are pathologically unable to tolerate not being the expert in your son's life? He asked. I paused. I am his father, I said. I have made many mistakes. Wanting to protect him from what I believe is a harmful clinical approach is not one of them. This isn't about me being the expert. It's about her not being one. Then Dr. Vance took the stand. She was poised, articulate. She defended her assessments as being based on the client's lived experience, which was, she argued, the primary data of therapy. She said the templates were guidelines to ensure thorough documentation, not scripts. She characterized the emails as private business discussions taken out of context. She portrayed herself as a dedicated clinician being harassed by a disgruntled parent. She was good, very good. But then the panel's psychologist member asked a quiet, devastating question. Dr. Vance, in your treatment plan for client BM, you state the father exhibits patterns consistent with relational trauma. Can you tell us the specific diagnostic tools you used to assess the father for these patterns? She hesitated. The assessment was based on the client's detailed reporting of historical interactions and observed behaviors. So you used no standardized tool. You conducted no clinical interview with the father. That is correct. The father was not a client of mine. Then, the psychologist said, leaning forward slightly, how did you rule out other potential factors contributing to the client's distress, such as unresolved grief or his own substance use history, as confounding variables in his perception of his father? The room was silent. Dr. Vance's attorney objected, saying the question called for speculation. The panel overruled him. They wanted her answer. She said, the client's perception is my clinical reality. It was the wrong answer. In a room of professionals, It sounded like dogma, not science. I saw Ben look up at her, a faint line appearing between his brows. The hearing lasted 2 days. We didn't get a decision that day. These things take weeks, sometimes months. We filed out of the room. In the hallway, Ben stood with Dr. Vance and her attorney. I walked past. I heard him say, "Anya, that question about diagnostic tools." She cut him off, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Ben, this is why these processes are so re-traumatizing. They get lost in technicalities and miss the human truth." He nodded, but the doubt on his face was now a visible crack. The waiting was a different kind of agony. The civil lawsuit was on hold pending the board's outcome. My life was in suspension. Then, 6 weeks later, the envelope arrived. The board's decision. I opened it with Martin on the phone. They found Dr. Anya Vance in violation of multiple ethical codes: gross negligence, practice outside scope of competence, failure to maintain proper boundaries. The evidence of the template system and the pattern of similar complaints was cited as demonstrating a reckless, standardized approach that caused foreseeable harm. Her license was suspended for 18 months. She was ordered to complete extensive supervision and ethics training. She was prohibited from treating clients presenting with family conflict for 3 years. The decision would be permanently posted on her public license record. It was a total victory, and it felt utterly hollow. I thanked Martin and hung up. I sat in my silent house. I had won. I had protected other families from her. I had upheld the standards of my profession, and I had likely cemented my son's belief that I was a vindictive man who had destroyed his healer. 2 days later, my doorbell rang. It was late evening. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door and Ben was standing there. He looked exhausted, older. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "Can I come in?" he finally asked. I stepped back. He walked into the living room, the same room where he'd played as a child. He didn't sit. "I read the board's decision," he said, his voice flat. "I figured you would." She called me. She said the board was corrupt, that they always side with the powerful against the vulnerable. She said I was the proof of her work, and that's why they targeted her. He was repeating her words, but without conviction. It sounded like a recitation. "What do you think?" I asked, my heart a drum in my chest. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw my son behind his eyes, not a client. I think when they asked her about the diagnostic tools, and she said my perception was her reality, that scared me. It sounded like a cult, not science. He swallowed hard. And I found the template, online, in a continuing education forum. She was selling it. The final surprise, he had done his own digging. "I know," I said softly, "we subpoenaed it." He nodded, looking at the floor. All this time I thought she saw me, the real me, but she was just filling in the blanks. His voice broke, and I let her. "I wanted it to be your fault so badly, because if it was your fault, then it wasn't mine, and it was Mom's for dying, and it wasn't just life being painful and random." The dam broke. He didn't cry dramatically. He just sank onto the couch and put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, ragged sobs. I sat beside him. I didn't touch him. I just waited. After a long time, he spoke into his hands. "I'm so sorry, Dad." "You have nothing to apologize for," I said, the words thick in my throat. "You were in pain. You reached for a lifeline. She was the one who failed her duty. I failed you too, by not finding a way to reach you that didn't feel like a therapy session." He looked up, his face ravaged. "What do we do now?" "We don't do anything," I said. "We just be. You can stay here tonight, or go home. You can call me tomorrow or next week. There's no script anymore, Ben, no treatment plan, just time." He stayed that night. In his old room, I didn't sleep. I listened to the quiet of the house, a different quiet than before. It wasn't empty, it was waiting. The civil lawsuit was dropped the following week. Without a license, her credibility was gone. The other parents, Sarah and the rest, formed a quiet support network. "We don't meet often, but we check in. Our children are on their own paths, some beginning tentative reconciliations, others still lost. There are no easy endings." Ben started seeing a new therapist, an older man specializing in grief and complicated family dynamics. His one condition was that I be allowed to speak with the therapist once to give my perspective. A bridge, not a wall. We have dinner every other Sunday. It's awkward sometimes. The trust is a fragile new thing. We talk about normal things, work, the weather. Sometimes we talk about his mom. The pain is still there, but it's our pain now, not a weapon. Last week, I was cleaning out my filing cabinet. I found the original annotated treatment plan from Dr. Vance. I held it, this document that had nearly destroyed us. Then I took it to the backyard, lit a match, and burned it in the old fire pit. I watched the words manipulative and enmeshed and relational trauma curl into black ash and float away. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was just cleaning house. The system worked, the license was suspended, the pattern was exposed, but the real cost and the real repair was never in that hearing room. It was in the quiet, terrible, and beautiful space between a father and a son, after all the professional armor had been stripped away. I learned that the most powerful therapy isn't found in a diagnosis or a template. It's found in the stubborn, flawed, and relentless act of not giving up. And sometimes, that has to be enough. Our story had an ending, but the question it raises doesn't have one. What is the line between supporting a client and imprisoning them in a story, between validating their pain and weaponizing it? The system worked in my case. A license was suspended. But for every case that reaches a hearing room, how many play out in silent living rooms and fractured phone calls with no one to file a complaint? The power dynamic in therapy is absolute. A client comes in a state of vulnerability, trusting the professional to hold their reality without exploiting it. When that trust is used to simplify the complex, to assign blame rather than explore pain, it doesn't just fail the client. It fails the very purpose of the healing arts. We go to therapy to untangle our stories, not to have them handed back to us prescripted with heroes and villains. The deeper, more uncomfortable truth is that Dr. Vance's method found a market because it offered a seductive relief, certainty. It is easier to believe your suffering has a single external cause, a manipulative parent, a toxic family, than to face the terrifying ambiguity of grief, personal responsibility, and random tragedy. Her template sold that certainty, and in a world filled with pain, that is a dangerous product to sell. This isn't an indictment of therapy. It is a call for vigilance from both sides of the cooch. For clients and families, you have a right to ask about your therapist's methods. You have a right to a second opinion. If your therapy is making you feel more isolated, more entrenched in anger, rather than more capable of connection, that is a red flag. For my colleagues, we must constantly examine our own alliances. Are we seeing the whole person or just the version presented to us? Are we knotting the limitations of our knowledge or letting our empathy solidify into dogma? The tools of psychology are powerful. They can rebuild a mind. They can also, as I saw, be used to dismantle a family. The difference often comes down to the humility of the person holding the tools, the understanding that we are not architects of our clients' lives, but perhaps guides through landscapes we ourselves have not fully mapped. Ben and I are finding our way. Some days are good, some are hard. The bridge we're building is made of small, ordinary things, a shared meal, a remembered joke, a silence that isn't charged with accusation. It is slow work. It is the antithesis of a template. So what did I learn? I learned that ethics are not just rules in a handbook. They are the daily practice of holding power with care. I learned that sometimes the most professional thing you can do is to be human first. And I learned that even when you use the system correctly, even when you win, the victory is not in the verdict. It's in the fragile, stubborn hope of a conversation that begins again. If this story resonated with you or made you think about the lines we draw between help and harm, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told. Thanks for listening.